Chris Christie, we just heard Adam Kinzinger talk about fear inside the Republican Party of opposing President Trump right now. But if an impeachment resolution actually comes to the floor, won't many Republicans be hard-pressed to oppose it?
Yeah, listen, I think they're all going to have to vote their conscience and look at what happened. I mean, what we had was an incitement to riot at the United States Capitol. We had people killed. And to me, there's not a whole lot of question here. So, you know.
So you think it was an impeachable offense?
Before Jordan. Oh, sure. Yeah. And
you'd vote to impeach.
I think that, you know, well, if I think it's an impeachable offense, that's exactly what I would do, George. But I'm not in there. But you want my opinion? That's my opinion. I think if inciting to insurrection isn't, then I don't really know what is. But I will say, too, that the Democrats, by what they did earlier on Ukraine, have kind of cheapened this a little bit, too. And I think that, you know, these are the type of actions which, you know, this mechanism was put into place for. And you know, I think a lot of Republicans at this point, I'm sure that Congressman Kinzinger is right, that there's some fear someplace, but I haven't heard it this week. What I've heard from fellow Republicans is that they've had enough. And that the president's conduct, quite frankly, since then, has gotten them upset. I mean, it is a national disgrace, George, that the flag at the White House is not at half staff for that Capitol Hill police officer, Kinnick, who gave his life in protecting one of our institutions of democracy. If we're having a fit of pique, and that's why we're not putting the flag at half staff, it's just another example of why people think that, you know, these decisions are not being made on the merits. These decisions are being made purely with an idea of what's in my own personal, you know, desire at the moment on the part of the president. And so it's just wrong.
On that, are you convinced by the argument that if he tried to self-pardon, that would actually invite a prosecution?
Listen, I think self-pardon at this point is off the table. I never thought it was something that was viable anyway, George. As you know, you've asked me about this before on the program. I never thought as a legal matter it was viable, but I think it's completely off the table now. I think if he tried to do something like that now, it would force Congress to act even after he was out of office. And so I'm sure that someone like Pat Cipollone, for instance, who's a smart, wise, tempered guy, I'm sure is trying to give him very strong advice this morning and throughout the next 10 days that this is not something he should go near at all.
When you have Chris Christie, the guy who quite literally coached Trump during the debate against Joe Biden, coming out and saying outright that Donald Trump should be impeached for inciting an insurrection, then there really isn't much hope for Trump to appeal to his allies to come to his aid. This comes in the aftermath of an insurrection born directly out of Trump's relentless insistence that the election was stolen from him because of fraud that decidedly did not exist. It wasn't proven in any of the 63 court cases that his campaign and its allies brought forward. Bill Barr and the DOJ said there was no fraud. Chris Krebs and the DHS's cybersecurity unit said that there was no fraud. Republican governors and secretaries of state said there was no fraud. Voting systems companies said there was no fraud. Recounts and audits confirmed there was no fraud. Even Rudy Giuliani admitted in court that he wasn't alleging fraud. And yet still Trump continued to ramp up these claims and manipulate his supporters, culminating into an insurrection at the Capitol. You could draw a straight line from Trump's words to the violence that occurred in his name. And while some Republicans desperately claim that we need to unify, there won't be any unity until there's accountability. And that starts, at a bare minimum, with Trump's impeachment. And that's exactly what's happening, as the House reportedly already has 210 co-sponsors for the impeachment resolution put forward by Representatives Jamie Raskin, Ted Lieu, and David Cicilline, where the only article drafted is, quote, incitement of insurrection. For that resolution to pass, only a simple majority of the House needs to vote for it, which means we're only a single-digit number of lawmakers away from this impeachment being a done deal, if it's not already by the time you watch this. But more important is what happens in the Senate, as only a conviction, which requires 2/3 of the Senate, would mean that they could then vote to bar Trump from ever holding federal office again. And if that fails to happen, if there's no accountability, then that is a tacit permission structure for others to do the same, to call for violence and incite riots and to have people killed. We've already seen it happen once. You can't cry ignorance if and when it happens again. Now, I do want to call out one thing that Chris Christie mentioned, which is this notion that having impeached Trump for the Ukraine extortion scheme somehow cheapened it because supposedly impeachment was more meant for something like this, which is utter nonsense. You don't get to get away with crimes because they're not the worst crimes possible. Would Chris Christie let a shoplifter walk free because he's not a murderer? Of course not. Trump extorted a foreign country for dirt on Joe Biden and then orchestrated a top-down, large-scale cover-up to hide his involvement. He abused his power and then obstructed Congress's investigation into that abuse. That is as impeachable as this is. Breaking the law is breaking the law, and the fact that Chris Christie thinks that extortion is somehow permissible isn't doing his judgment any favors here. But regardless of whether you're weighing Trump's previous impeachment or his current one, the point here is obvious, and that is that Donald Trump traffics in lawlessness. He paraded himself around as some type of law and order candidate because all he knows is projection. In reality, he cares about law and order about as much as he cares about spending time with Barron. He pretends to be the law and order candidate just like he pretends to be some evangelical messiah, some savior of God in the White House. Donald Trump, the guy who gave the rich a tax cut, who cut food programs to the hungry, who tried to take healthcare away from seniors and the disabled and low-income Americans, who had an affair while his wife was home pregnant with their son, who incited a violent mob to kill his political enemies. Yeah, just like Jesus would have wanted. The truth is that this impeachment vote will be a test for whether our elected officials in both parties are following their oaths of office or Donald Trump. And because of what we've seen over the past few days, because we have indisputable proof that he incited an armed insurrection that led to the deaths of not only a police officer, but several of his own supporters, we know that you can't support both. You don't get to pretend that a vote against impeachment is still, somehow, abiding by your oath of office. You don't get to pretend that you're defending the Constitution when Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states that no elected official shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution. And by virtue of Trump lying to his supporters about a stolen election, summoning them to the Capitol with tweets promising that it'll be, quote, wild, and those very people overtaking the U.S. Capitol for the first time in 219 years, where they were looking to kill both Democrats and Republicans who didn't pledge allegiance to those exact claims about a stolen election, well, that makes it pretty damn clear that Trump incited an insurrection and defied the Constitution. So take a good look at how Congress votes in this upcoming impeachment vote, and you'll know who's defending their oath of office, this country, and our democracy, and you'll also know who's defending a wannabe despot who incited a riot that left at least 5 Americans dead and our Capitol in ruins. This isn't a partisan issue, it's an American one. And this vote to impeach should be the easiest one ever cast by all 435 lawmakers in Congress. While you're here, please check out my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I take a deep dive into the top stories of the week, and I also interview major players in the world of politics, like Kamala Harris, Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Pete Buttigieg, Katie Porter, Al Franken, Cory Booker, Jamie Harrison, Mary Trump, and many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.